Hi everybody! Today I'll be showing how to make a long bead, and this is for the Facebook group Beginning Lampworker Fun Challenges, and it's the December challenge. And so I hope you enjoy. I made a simple long bead, and it's not super long. It's about 2 1/8 inches. These can be, of course, a lot longer, but let's get started and I'll show you how it's made. Before we begin the bead, I wanted to give you a little information about dipping the mandrels and how it'll best serve for making long beads. So basically, and I know this is probably obvious, is you want to have a perfectly straight mandrel. You can use brand new mandrels for this, you can use thicker mandrels, but just the slightest little kink or imperfection in your mandrel can cause that bead not to want to come off because these are so long, these beads. So they're more difficult to get off anyway, but if there's any kind of imperfection or slight bend or anything in there, it can make it impossible really to get them off the mandrel. So you want to make sure your mandrel is nice and straight, and when you coat it in your bead release, you want to make sure you have a nice even coating all the way throughout wherever you're going to lay down your glass. So just an FYI there. And then there's also another technique that some bead makers like to use, and that's center dipping the mandrel. So basically you have a really tall jar, like a tall skinny olive jar or something, and you dip your mandrel all the way in, and then you can remove one end of it. So basically you can have two handles on your mandrel. This makes it really easy for you to, transfer from one hand to another. And also when rolling, you can use two hands to roll and get much more even pressure when you're making those long beads. And so it might be a lot easier to get a nice even shape if you have two hands rolling at once, and so you have pressure from both ends. And so just an FYI there. I really don't use too much the center dipping method, but you might want to try it and it might make it a little easier for you. So let's get started. Okay, so here I am working with a mandrel I had already dipped, and this is about a 2.5 inch or so, maybe 2 3/4 inch long dipped section. And so my bead is going to be a little over 2 inches, maybe 2 1/8 inches long is this bead. So it's not a super long bead, but hopefully it'll show you how to make a longer bead. And you might want to start with a little bit of a shorter bead to begin with, and when you feel confident you can go longer and longer. So basically, I want to make sure that whole length of bead release is all heated up before I start laying on my glass. So I'm going to start laying on this light turquoise that I'm using. Start with a nice coil on the end, and then I continue moving over. And you want to make sure this glass is really molten when you're putting it on. And it might be a little hard to tell from this angle, but my two hands are making a really wide V shape while I'm putting this glass on. My right hand is dipping downward. I'm holding the mandrel upward on an angle a little bit, and my left hand is about a 30-degree angle with that rod going into the previous coil, like melting into the previous coil as I'm feeding that glass around. So you don't want to trap any air bubbles or anything in this. So if you have a wide angle and your glass is really molten and just flowing on, you should be fine and not trap any air in there. And so basically I have it as long as I want. I have my footprint set, which is basically the glass that touches the mandrel. And I'm just adding a little more glass because it was skinnier on the left side of this bead, more so than on the right. Putting a little coil on the end there, and just adding a little more glass to bulk it out and try to get this cylinder. I'm going to try to make a long cylinder as my base bead. and trying to get it all even all the way across. So you want to make sure when working with long beads like this that you're always going back and forth and heating the whole thing, especially the two ends, because the mandrel is going to cool down faster than the glass will actually cool down, and it'll start sucking out the heat from your bead. So you want to make sure, especially the ends, you keep them warm. So flash them in the flame every once in a while and keep those ends nice and warm so you don't have any cracking issues. So basically, I'm just heating this whole bead up, and I like to focus on the ends to get the nice dimpled holes. So you have your foundation holes, and to get that even first before I roll the whole bead. And so now that I was melting that in a bit, my right end was still a little bit too skinny, so I'm adding a little glass there. And then I have a little dip right there, so I'm going to add a little more glass there, so then I can have a nice, even, long barrel shape all the way across. And this is going to be my base bead. And then I can build up and make any type of shape I want after this is completed. So I'm working on the ends still, and then I'm going to show you how to roll. And I'm going to back off on the camera a little bit so you can see I'm going to roll on a brass plate, which is a piece of brass on top of some steel, and it makes it a lot easier to get a nice even bead if you roll it on a really long surface. It doesn't have to be brass. It could be a really long graphite pad like the one above it. I could have two graphite pads like that together and have a long surface. And even if you have a paddle that has a really long surface, if you gently roll this, and you're not putting a lot of pressure, you're just rolling it back and forth. Gently roll it after it's all heated all the way across, roll back and forth, and it makes it much easier to get an even bead so it's not fatter on one side than the other, of the mandrel, and crooked on the mandrel. And so a lot of lamp workers use this technique, a really long roll, to be able to get a nice even surface. And so basically I have my base, and now I can decorate. You could do whatever you want. If I wanted to roll this in frit, if I wanted to use silver glass, it's whatever you want to add to this to decorate. And I'm using a twisty. It's a yellow and purple and green twisty. And I'm just going to wrap this around to give it a little bit of design in the center. And so basically this bead is going to be fatter in the center than on the ends. So it's going to be like a long tapered barrel shape. And so I'm adding the end of this twisty, and this is just a piece of twisty I had left over on my bench. I'm adding this to it. It's kind of lumpy and bumpy. That's okay. We'll even that out. And don't forget, every once in a while you want to go back and heat your ends. You don't have to heat them a lot, just a very slight glow. Just give them a little heat to keep them solid and keep them from cracking. And now I'm adding a really dark purple, transparent purple, on both sides of this twisty, just like a border. So it's basically whatever design you really want to make on these. It's all up to you. I'm just showing you a couple things that I threw together for this bead. So now I got my purple on the edges, and I'm heating both of those ends. If you notice there, giving a little bit of heat to both ends. You don't have to heat until it's molten and moving. You just have to give it a little bit of glow to keep it warm. And so I'm kind of melting in both of those sides. They don't have to be totally melded and totally fixed at this point, because I'm going to do a little more design to this bead. And I have this sped up again, surprisingly, but so my right end is still really a little bit skinnier than the left, and I have to keep adding glass because for some reason it never got as fat as the other end. So you can always add a little bit more glass if you need it. So I'm trying to start my nice taper there for this really elongated, like bicone shape. And then I'll solidify that end a little bit better. And so basically I'm just trying to shape this back and forth. And now I'm going to make some little twisties between the turquoise and the dark purple. And I just grabbed a light and dark blue twisty that I had on my bench. And I'm just giving them a little twist. So basically I'm spot heating right between the purple and blue there. And I'm grabbing it, or I'm touching my stringer, and you're not plunging it in, you're just touching it and then giving it a little twist, and it makes like a little swirly wave type of pattern in your bead. And this gives it a little transition between the two colors. Of course you don't have to do this, but just a little transitional section. And there's kind of a close-up of how those little swirls look. And I'm going to do the same on the opposite side. I have 4 swirls on each side, and I'm doing these, I'm twisting in the opposite direction for this side. And so I could have went in the same direction or an opposite direction, but either way you want to do it. I just have this sped up here just so you don't have to watch it all. I gave some heat to that other end, as you see. You want to make sure you keep going back and forth and putting heat in those ends. And so I'm going to melt this down now. And it's still not perfectly shaped yet. And I'm going to just add one last element to this bead, and that's a few yellow dots that I'm going to add into the purple sections. And I didn't have a stringer. If I was totally prepared with this, I would have had a stringer. But since I don't, I was tapering down the yellow to make a point, like a pencil point, so I can get skinnier little dots there. So I'm just adding a few dots around. And I could leave these raised if I wanted to, but I would have wanted to make sure that I finalized my shape and my shape was all even before I actually put on those dots. But I'm melting these all in, so I didn't have to worry about my shape being totally perfect before putting the dots on. But I did want to put the dots on after I did the twisting, because doing the twisting I could have pulled some of those dots out of shape. So I wanted to make sure I did those little twists before putting the dots on. So basically now I'm just finishing up the shape, and I have to get that cone a little more evened and have the high point more in the middle. It's a little off center still. And that's what I'm working on here. And I have this sped up again. And we're getting there. It's pretty close. I'm using gravity a little bit, turning it up and down, letting it droop a little bit. And I still need a little bit more blue glass on that one skinnier end. It was still too skinny. Make sure the other end's hot. And then I'll go work on that end and try to get it a little more even. And so I could have shaped this out into a flat barrel again, so it's whatever kind of shape you wanted it to be. But I kind of like the long tapered bicone shape. Looks pretty neat. And we're pretty much just about done. And I'll get a close-up here in a second. And there you go. There's the final bead. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed.